Actually glad to get here. I went around the front entrance to Crow Park thinking it was the entrance. I think some of you may have done this to find a great big grey stretch limo, which I thought was really stretching the theme of toward recovery, but thankfully it wasn't. This conference, I'm very glad to be here. It's a personal pleasure to be here. I want to make an apology in advance because I've about 10 months since I actually hosted a debate about Ireland's economic future in a TV studio. I'm a bit rusty in my moderation skills. Also to apologise, I've been very much at the micro-economic coalface of Ireland's economic future. Founded my own business about 10 months ago. And that's why it's a personal pleasure to be here, because for the last 10 months trying to set up a business in a time of not just recession but dislocation has proven to me just how dislocated and detached debate at a national level on the airwaves and also I suppose politically has become from the reality of people who have new ideas, who want to see innovation and change, and how dislocated that debate has become from the reality, the human reality of where we are right now. So it's a personal privilege to be here, to be part of this discussion this afternoon. I think it's also looking at the breakout sessions you've had, and I think the purpose of today and this afternoon session is simply to bring together as much as possible those 6 breakout sessions and the ideas you've been discussing into a manageable form at the end of the day. It, for me, just seems to be remarkable that we don't get more of this kind of discussion that is so linked into the reality on the ground. To see, for example, that this is not short-term or narrow or just Irish, that where we are right now is about a global dislocation in terms of the balance of economic power, in terms of the technology that's changing our lives, and I suppose also the challenges that climate change poses and the challenges of sustainability in the broadest sense. So that's all I'm going to say today. I will introduce you individually to 6 speakers who we hope will sum up, not necessarily report back from the breakout sessions, but sum up the themes that they've been hearing from those sessions in their own personal way. And they're going to talk for hopefully just under 5 minutes. I may have to exercise my former primetime techniques, although hopefully people will be able to finish the sentence. But 5 minutes is the limit. And first of all, to talk about that first breakout session on enterprise and entrepreneurship, public and private, please welcome from Maynooth, an old friend of mine, Sean O'Rian.
Thank you, Mark. And I didn't even manage to give my talk to the session in under 5 minutes, so not quite sure how I'm going to summarise it. I'll take Mark at his word in terms of balancing reporting back and giving my own perspective. I do think the overall, what are we looking at in terms of an overall transformation in new economic paradigms? And I think in many ways, obviously we've had what was in many ways a liberal paradigm. And growth in liberal economies is really driven by trying to free up capital flows. And I think in a sense what we want to think about is democratizing and steering those capital flows. In the East Asian economies, that was about steering capital towards productive investment. In the social democratic economies, I think in many respects it was about steering capital towards egalitarian productive investment. And again, in a sense, that's kind of the motto that's been running through my mind in thinking about economic recovery, is that when we recover, rather than, it even improves the politics of redistribution if you can have egalitarian investment to begin with, rather than having to, as we do now, redistribute from a highly unequal income distribution. I think that poses so, and the other point I think is that involves irreducible public and collective kind of element to it. That social investment is both more egalitarian and has very strong kind of productive outcomes. So can we do it? And in that sense, I think one of the interesting things in our discussion earlier this afternoon, this morning, about enterprise and employment was the rich kind of diversity of ideas, both in terms of kind of policies and institutions that we have to work with right now. The fact that the kind of grant aid policies to indigenous companies, that the assessments of those grant aid schemes are actually positive, that they do generate employment and exports and so on, but also the rich kind of diversity of ideas and options that were advanced within the room, both in terms of how to manage privatization, where I think Donald gave an excellent presentation in terms of that there are choices involved here. It's not simply a matter of public versus private, but how it's done, and how it's managed. So we need to think about, in a sense, democratically about what the outcomes we're seeking are. And that can't simply be reduced to state versus market, but all the way to what kind of relationship should exist between universities and firms, what kinds of new training and education structures do we come up with that can tackle this employment and skills crisis that we're left with. So in all of those, and I think one of the things that really brought home to me was, at the most general level, was the sense in which the last 10 years, in part the whole building and financial boom has kind of distorted the economy, but it has also kind of buried the kind of things that we learned, the lessons that we learned in the 1990s. Not just about macroeconomic stability and so on, but also about what are the things that work in the arts, in community development, in enterprise development and so on, the kinds of new initiatives that were happening in the late 1990s that really got kind of sidelined or buried. And in a sense, it's kind of depressing to see reports coming up with notional figures of 100,000, 300,000 jobs in the name of agencies, which we know within those agencies there are people who know what's going on within the Irish economy in great detail and in great subtlety, and who know what enterprises need. And that the kind of learning that has happened within the state, within semi-state organisations, and within community and university organisations and so on, has really been kind of buried within our debate, and that, and that is a great loss economically, because if innovation means anything, it means that kind of diversity of opinion and inputting that into organisations. A couple of things I should just briefly mention from today. I'm probably running out of time already, right?
Maybe another minute.
Okay, another minute. Three, I think, very hopeful points that I would pick up on from today. One is, where do we get the capital for investment? And it's really given me hope today to think about the range of suggestions in terms of where we get that capital from, right from this morning's discussion. Right from kind of our own internal rebudgeting, through our own internal resources with the National Pension Fund, through using the banks, which we have signally failed to do to date, and right up to negotiating with the EU. So that's the first point. The second is the critical role of equality within recovery. And not simply just in terms of the benefits for the individuals and their families and their communities, but also in terms of the return on the productive investment that you get when you invest equally across the economy. And third is the critical importance of re-legitimating the public role. And I think possibly the most challenging aspect of economic recovery is that right after the crisis of the legitimacy of markets and the downgrading of developers and bankers and so on, very quickly we were followed with a crisis of the legitimacy of the public sector, where people lost faith in, because of the failures of regulation and so on, lost faith in the ability of government and the public sphere to contribute to economic recovery. And I think we do have elements within our story to date that we can build on, and it's absolutely critical that we get beyond this debate, which kind of vilifies the public sector, to thinking about what are the positive contributions that the public sector can make. So I'll leave it with that.
Thank you, Sean.
There is a quotation, and I won't delay long on it, Mark. It's a quotation I've used before. A civilization in decline digs its grave with relentless insistency. It cannot be argued out of its willful way. And I think that summarizes where we are at the moment. I think it can be different. But I'm going to briefly come back to that. Just a couple of propositions. One, on the banking crisis, we didn't have the data, and we still don't. Peter Matthews this morning distributed some extremely important, rigorous, evidence-based data that really would repay study. But the bad news is going to get worse. And it's going to get worse because the official figures that were released on Bad Thursday underestimate where we are. For example, they don't take account of the the interest-only mortgage, that whole home ownership sector that is mired in deep negative equity, and it doesn't take account of the second round effects of a failure of our banking system, now publicly owned, to support businesses. We got our priorities wrong. So the data is still running behind the curve. Thirdly, I think we are proactively, or rather reactively, we are reactively trying to resuscitate a system that has failed utterly, not because the people in the banking sector didn't know what was right and what was wrong. I would argue that many of the experienced bank staff, many highly ethical professional people they said it to me, this is just wrong. But somehow or other, the corporate mindset was not in the business of listening. I'm not quite sure they still are. Lastly, I would say we are locked into an orthodoxy. Just talking over lunchtime with some people, we are locked into an orthodoxy that has allowed us to be boxed in to a 4-year program of adjustment that wasn't even feasible last year, looking at the growth figures. It assumed growth of 4%, an annual average growth rate of 4% last year. Now, since then, we've had a lot of instances. A 3% budget deficit wasn't feasible by 2014 last year. After all this happened, it's simply impossible. And yet, every mainstream political party has impaled itself on something that makes no sense for Ireland and provides an alibi for Europe, because the Stability and Growth Pact figures for Europe, they're obsolete. They were framed in a different time and a different place. They are covering up the deep fissures in Europe and preventing a rational debate. There is no real rationale behind adjusting by 2014. So much in that. We have 4 options. The first option is to continue as we are. And God help us, that's what we're doing. That's what we're doing, except that we're cutting more deeply. And that's wholly counterproductive. On an election, in a democracy, that's a right, and I can understand that. But if the people coming in are locked into the same orthodoxy, we are still faced with feeling impelled to adhere to a set of criteria that make no sense for Ireland and even less sense for Europe. The third is intervention by the EU, IMF. People think there's a difference. Since the May Council meeting, there is no difference. You go back to Europe for financial assistance to help fund our society. It will be granted, but only on IMF conditionality, and the IMF will monitor it. Now, I don't think that will solve the problem for Ireland or Europe. It will be 4 years, followed incidentally by 4 more years of rigour. But it won't solve the problem. But it will break the back of this economy and prevent our very best resources being used. And yes, I am talking about young people. We have 44% of our population under 30 years of age. We have one of the highest rates of university participation in the OECD, and they're being shut out of renewing our economy. What sense does that make? Or the final option is to renew and redevelop our economy. Not just our economy, but our society and our politics. That won't happen in 4 years. It may happen in 10. If there is a consensus and we drop the old legacy nonsense, it may happen in 10. But it is certainly a goal worth pursuing. And democracy owes that to us and owes it to our children. Now, I have said absolutely nothing about banking, and I've run out of time. But anyway, there you are.
Ray, thank you.
Thank you, Mark. I'd like to continue the tradition of summarizing the breakout sessions, but also putting a little bit of personal spin on it. We started by talking about the tiger and inequality, and as strange as it may seem to the participants in this particular conference, this is still, in fact, controversial. Did the Celtic Tiger increase inequality in Ireland? There's a famous ESRI study which argues that in fact it didn't, on the basis that the standard measure of inequality, the Gini coefficient, did not in fact increase over the course of the Tiger. The problem with this, of course, is that the problem here is not with equality or inequality in Ireland. The problem is with the Gini coefficient. It's an inadequate measure, and it shows just how seriously our major economic think tank takes the question of inequality. This is taken from the heap chart, which my colleague Jason Lockery and I prepared. This is Irish income at the beginning of the Celtic Tiger. And what you can see here is that most people were bunched around a particular level of income, a particular mode, a relatively low mode, as it turns out. The green line is income at the end of the Tiger, and you can see that the distance between the people on the bottom and the people on the top has lengthened greatly. This is fundamentally missed by the standard measures of economic inequality. The second thing we talked about was the crisis in inequality. Now, inequality was a cause of the crisis. It acted as a cause of the crisis through the corrosion of our consumption habits and the emergence of massive amounts of debt finance in both the corporate and household economies. Inequality, if the government gets its way, is also going to be a consequence of this crisis, but it's still not too late. We talked about how inequality matters. Inequality is unfair. Unequal societies are poverty-ridden. Inequality exacerbates all social problems and undermines social cohesion. Although, if I can just say as an aside, I think social cohesion, or certainly more social cohesion, is the last thing that Ireland needs at the moment. What we need is fundamentally a break with the elite consensus, a break with their elite policy, a break with their vision, and a break with their forms of political action. We looked at a number of responses to inequality. And here we did not, much as I agree with Robin Hood. Robin Hood was right. I hope you agree Robin Hood was right. But we did not call, in fact, for redistribution. What we called for was a restructuring of the basic character of the Irish economy. We need to get unemployment down. We need, in Larry Michel's words, to put jobs first. But in order to do that, we need to collectively guarantee people employment. We need to strengthen trade unions, which is about changing the balance of forces in Irish society between capital and labor. We need to institute more universal public benefits and public services, not less, including the area of social housing, an obvious use for the ghost estates littering the Irish countryside, and also improving the Irish education system. At that point, and only at that point really, did we begin to talk about taxes and benefits. And I'd just like to call a little more attention to the heap chart. A picture of inequality in Irish society. Who should bear the cost of this crisis? The solutions to Ireland's budget crisis have tended to point directly at the very bottom of this income distribution. We're already being softened up for benefit and pension cuts. But the solutions themselves, in fact, if we're talking about tax, rest at the upper end of this income distribution. Finally, Bjorn Vott talked about the distribution of wealth as reflecting the distribution of power, and that questions of poverty are questions which are systemic. That is, they're rooted in the system. They're enforced by the mobility of capital, something that Bjorn has talked about over the course of today, and that there is no quick fix. We need to think about fundamentally changing the source of the inequality, which is our distribution of power and authority within the economy as well as within the polity. Thank you.
Again, I'm going to try to be very brief. The session was called Regulating for Recovery, Corporate Governance. And I suppose the first thing I'd say about that is that Ray Kinsella threw up an overhead showing really what he called the emerging topography of corporate governance. And it was really a very, very dense overhead. It just showed, globally, EU, national regulatory authorities, company law, etc., etc. And I suppose his basic point out of all of that is that it just hasn't worked. And then Damien Tobin made the point that by looking only at the macro and ignoring the micro, we can miss the damage that can be inflicted at company level. And I suppose that gives me a way into talking about a study that we did, and I just want to talk about it for a couple of minutes. In TASC, we did a study called Mapping the Golden Sector, and we published it about 6 months ago. And what we were doing was empirically examining how the boards of the top 40 companies in Ireland, or at least among the top companies in Ireland, how those boards worked. And I suppose it's worth saying that while that might seem like a small number, they were among the top, and they were economically very important. Between them, they employed, about 300,000 people and were valued at around 80 billion. So they do represent a major wedge of the economy. And what we found was that even though there were more than 500 directors in the period, there was a network of just 39 people, 39 individuals who held multiple directorships on at least 2 boards across 33 of the 40 companies examined. Now, the research we did therefore showed that these 39 people with multiple directorships tied together the three quarters of the companies, so that through their cross directorship and multiple directorships, those 40 companies were interrelated. And between them, these 39 people held 93 of the directorships on the boards of these companies. And just give you 1 or 2 more figures, we also found that those same 39 people, in addition to their directorships on the 40 companies, held significant additional directorships. That means that outside the companies we looked at, they held an average of 10 additional directorships, and in some instances considerably more. There was in fact one outlier of 57 companies, so that was a very busy person. This obviously raises 2 issues, and I haven't time to go into them, but they are obviously the issues, and I have to say potential, because obviously we can't be sure, but there's the potential, at least, of overextension, and therefore implications for how you can run the company. And then there is also obviously the possibility of conflicts of interest. A second point I want to make is that there is an important related issue, I think, in what this tells us about the distribution of power. We published this report just as we were waking up to the extent of the banking crisis, with its huge implications for Irish society. The facts uncovered by the report allowed us to illustrate really much of what had gone wrong with corporate governance in Ireland in the past, and to pose some questions that are really still not answered about how we mean to strengthen corporate governance in the future. And I'm just going to hit 1 or 2 of those. One of them is like, why is there such a lack of diversity on boards of directors? For example, why are there so few women on boards? Only 1 in 14 in the private sector and only 1 in 5 in the public sector. And the second question is, what is a reasonable level of pay for board members or for chairpersons or for CEOs? We found that the average CEO pay of the group we looked at was 136 times the poverty threshold. So we found pay levels way out here or there to employees and other stakeholders. And we now know that there is a considerable body of evidence that this bias is linked to a whole range of adverse economic and social consequences, not least greater income and wealth inequalities in society as a whole. I'll just come to a third point and final one. The financial regulator and the Irish Stock Exchange have held consultations about tightening up the corporate governance rules. And if implemented, and I suppose much more importantly, followed through on, again a theme that came up in our session, these would go some way to address the situation. But once again, there really is a political dimension which goes beyond the remit of regulators. If the political parties want to rebuild the economy and make sure the corporate mistakes of the past are harder, at least, to repeat, then they must take this issue of corporate governance seriously. The public interest is what should be uppermost. And this isn't particularly radical. In other countries, there are at least various efforts to do this. Again, we don't have time to go into them. But at the very least, we must have more diversity on the boards of all private companies and public bodies. Quotas to ensure this are already in place in countries like Norway. We need more stakeholder representation on boards, including employee-appointed directors. That's something Pat Compton in our session talked about. We need strict limits on holding multiple directorships, particularly for CEOs and for chairpersons. We need transparency about remuneration, with caps in place in the public sector, and we need an independent system of appointments to the boards of public bodies. But, and this is my very last point, we should also be taking seriously building a legislative basis for this, one that would include an obligation to make the board of a company's overriding duty the promotion of the long-term success of the company. It goes without saying, of course, and we all know the disastrous outcomes of the short-termism that we've witnessed in banking decisions. And taking Asborn was, again, very serious point that we won't tackle poverty unless we first tackle the structure of the economic system. I think we should be at least looking at one of his suggestions, which is ways of increasing employee ownership. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mark. The Canadian experience with alternative budgets has come up a few times over the course of the day. So I thought a couple of days ago I did a workshop on this. It took me a few hours. So I'm going to try to boil it down to 5 minutes, and hopefully it'll give you at least a sense of what our experience has been. And you can judge for yourself what you think the applicability might be to your own experience. So, I mean, the starting point of this is that budgets are the single most important event in the life of a government in the years where the major economic policy statements are made. And despite attempts to try to snow you and hoodwink you with the technical mumbo jumbo, these are political documents. They're political, and they stem from a series of values and priorities. So you change the values of priorities and you get a much different result. Now, we've been doing this for about 15 years, and the first year that we did it, in fact, this was kind of the impetus that brought groups together, the moment was similar, though not nearly as extreme as it is now in Ireland and in Canada, because we're about to get our first austerity budget. But 15 years ago, we knew that there would be major public sector cuts. And civil society organizations, in their representations, in their lobbying, in their meetings with politicians, We're told that, well, there's no alternative, we can't afford what you're asking for. Well, maybe one or two, but we really don't want a shopping list from you. So what this was really a driving force in coming together to develop a kind of a common front or a consensus and a plan around which a wide spectrum of civil society organizations could coalesce. So as I said, there's widespread participation in our first year, in the first meetings, across the spectrum, across the progressive spectrum, and you name it, women's groups, anti-poverty groups, labor, Aboriginal groups, culture, and the list goes on and on. And labor is an important player and certainly a major funder of this initiative, but to its credit, did not kind of dominate. And I think this is absolutely crucial, that something like this is not seen as labor's budget. And all the groups that participated felt that it was essential to have a forum that was coordinated by an independent body like ourselves, an independent research body that was also trusted. And sort of like where TASC may be at the present moment, should you agree to move ahead in this kind of a direction. So the starting point was to talk about what are the kind of basic core values and priorities. So a lot of discussion about those, and then articulation of a set of values and priorities, and that became the ticket to participation. Any group that agreed to the basic values was entitled to participate. Now the uniqueness, I suppose one of the unique features, probably the single most unique feature, was the development of an alternative economic and fiscal framework. So the government puts out its framework. It projects what growth is going to be over the next year, over the next 2 years, or more, and what those implications are for revenue and expenditures, and sometimes yes, sometimes no, what the employment implications of that are. And so what we do is we look at that framework. If we think it's a good framework, we adopt it. If we think it's not a good framework, we modify it. And that is the basis then. We use that macroeconomic and fiscal framework for our own alternative budget. So then we develop a set of tax measures. Well, no, let me go back a second, because what we do is we look at a set of macroeconomic constraints. So, for example, what sort of fiscal deficit are we prepared to run? What sort of debt-GDP ratio are we prepared to run? What about taxes? Are we going to increase the overall tax level, or are we going to make it, we're going to decrease it, or we're going to keep it constant? And then restructure. How are we going to deal with high income taxes versus sales taxes, or that kind of thing? There's a whole range of ways in which we consider that what the best way to restructure the tax system. So once and discussing these constraints can be a very vigorous exercise. There's lots of debate about what we should accept, what's responsible, unquote. But we do impose upon ourselves a kind of discipline. And this forms the framework, and it has to be workable, and it has to be, or at least it has to be defensible. So we've got the framework, we've got our tax and our spending measures, and we insert them into the framework because, you know, if you're going to, as I think Larry was saying this morning, if you're going to spend $1 billion on infrastructure, that's going to have $1 billion worth of impact on the economy, but it'll also have a multiplier impact on GDP. So it may add an extra $500 million to the economy. It also brings back revenue into the economy. So the multiplier effects are important to insert into the model to show the benefits. To show the benefits in terms of the revenues, in terms of expenditures, in terms of growth, and in terms of employment creation. So that's basically how we do it in a nutshell. And I'll end with my last point, which is what is the value of the alternative budget been for us? And the first thing is it has been an exercise in demythologizing budgets, in confidence building, in empowering citizens. It's been a public accountability, holding government to account. It's been a tool for popular mobilization, for campaigns of participant organizations. It's been a vehicle for building consensus amongst a wide range of civil society organizations around a common alternative that they can use and that they can defend and they can demand change. And it's also been, you know, a really important vehicle through which people in respective organizations who somebody mentioned this morning are kind of locked into their silos. It's a way of looking beyond their silos and looking at the bigger picture. And it's a really useful tool thereby for building coalitions and broadening coalitions for civil society. So I'll leave it there. I'm sure my 5 minutes is more than up.
Well, the podium here is better to see you as we take questions now and open to the floor. Just say, as we open up to the floor, obviously we're welcoming. Well, take a seat, that'd be a great shot. Opening up to questions and to comments, but not speeches, if you don't mind. So let's just start off with who's going to be the first question today.
I had two comments. One, there was a very interesting comment at the beginning about how there's disappointment, not just in the private sector, but also in the public sphere. It reminded me a bit about how people were talking in the middle of a crisis in Argentina. Everybody was very desperate. Everybody was looking for jobs in other countries. And one of the things that, it's a bit general, but if the labor movement, if the Labour Party, the progressive forces, can come out with a sort of message of hope, saying, you know, this is with this old model, but we have a different model, and we can deliver, you know, growth, income equality, greater income equality. I think that could be politically quite powerful. And so therefore, in a way, there's an opportunity, because also you need to kind of lift up spirits, because you can talk yourself into a recession, you can talk yourself into very negative feelings. My second point is, I think that what Bruce presented is extremely positive, very exciting, and gives a concrete opportunity for people to participate. My question to him is, how do you avoid the kind of Labour Party Kinnock trap, which is when the Labour Party, just before the election, announced that they would have some increases of taxes, which they actually targeted on the very rich, which were a very good idea, but the press misinterpreted it and said, no, Labour wants to be the party of taxation, and that contributed to Labour defeat. And since then, Labour in England has always been, in the UK, has always been very woolly about their proposals. So how do you avoid, even very good proposals that would not harm the majority of the people that would probably benefit, being misused by a sort of conservative press?
Thank you, Stephanie. I'm sure it's the...
I mean, the same thing has happened in the Canadian context, and I'll just give you an example. And we sort of pushed the Social Democratic Party in opposition to to implement this as part of their electoral platform. I don't know if this is done in Ireland, but in Canada, parties, as part of their electoral platforms, they usually outline the measures and they cost them. And one of the focus of our tax package was actually fairly well replicated in the Social Democratic election platform. And amongst those was an inheritance tax. Now, the inheritance tax was only on, the top 2% of income earners, but the other side were very clever and were able to portray this as, as a tax that affected everybody. And so they really got hammered, and they were forced to really downplay it and ultimately withdraw it. And so it is a trap. And I'm not saying that that a political party needs to take these into consideration, but it's I don't know. I don't know how it would challenge that when you've got a very powerful media, a business community that is very resistant. I would expect, Larry, in the American situation, similar kinds of traps have been set for progressive Democratic politicians, but it is a real challenge. There's no easy answers to it.
Thank you, Bruce.
To bring hope and optimism to the argument, and I know this is something I said yesterday, but just in technology, that Mark mentioned briefly, the growing technology, I think the centre for that hope is to be found, and I think it's a challenge for economists to look at how the new economics, or there will be new economics to reflect the new technological circumstances. From railroads through to .com, we've had investment, we've had markets, herd mentality, and the panics that come from that. But the exponential growth of technology that's been mapped by lots of people very carefully does a few things. First of all, it doesn't follow the traditional supply-based theory of economics, because there is not that shortage of these items that we're buying and selling that you would normally have. It opens up small businesses, it opens up individuals like the guy on Facebook to make obscene amounts of money with very little investment, and it enables a greater equality because of the fact that these things are very easily communicated and transferred and so on. And I think that if that exponential growth, which has been mapped so many times, is taken to its logical conclusion, that the changes that are coming from this technological revolution become actually more and more rapid and more important. And I don't think economics has reflected that yet. And I think that the Labour Party and whoever wants to speak for progressives need to jump on that bandwagon of hope that the economy should actually multiply in the coming years and not depress itself. Okay.
There was a survey done last year across 10 G20 countries, and it was found that 2 out of 3 people felt that the recession was caused by a breakdown or a crisis in values and ethics. And I think one of the remarkable things about the last 15, 20 years is that any discussion about ethics and values was kind of completely seen as not part of the discussion, even within progressive economics kind of spaces as well. And I think the hope, actually, and I think, from yesterday and today, the hope I'm taking away is that there is a discussion beginning about ethics and values, and the values of equality and values of sustainability have to be at the centre of that kind of reimagining the future and reshaping the future. And I think the more we're explicit about our values that we want and the society we want, as opposed to the mechanisms of how we might get there, the more that becomes a kind of the common sense, or and it becomes valued, and it becomes legitimate to have that kind of to stand for those values. And I think that's the hope I'm taking from today.
Thank you.
Just, I suppose, first of all, to talk about the message of hope. But other thing is that I noticed that a lot of the talk, both here today and within mainstream media, is on the deficit and on the cuts and on the austerity. I think that we're focusing terribly much on the liabilities, and I think we should look at the assets. Mark, you and I both joined the stock of entrepreneurship in the country this year, and I think it's amazing that we're focusing on the 3 companies shutting down every day and not on the 36 opening every day. I think that it's amazing that we're focusing on the cost of our imports and not on the fact that 67 billion last year was generated from exports, and that only 3.5% of service companies export, and they can generate that among them. And the other thing as well is that although we're responsible for 1% of the EU GDP, we have got 193 billion, or 6% of the inward foreign direct investment. And just, I suppose, just to go back to the panel, on the note of entrepreneurship and on recovery, I noticed that we're looking towards the National Reserve Fund, etc., for entrepreneurship and to take funding from there. I would go further. I think we need to go back to second level and even primary level schools and to create entrepreneurship as an actual career choice. When I was filling out my CAO form, entrepreneurship wasn't there, despite the fact that's the road that I wanted to take. And it can be done. I did it myself 2 years ago. I went to the department about putting a stock market training module into transition year, which is already being taught across the country, so this can be done. And I think we should really talk with a different type of grammar. It should be a more positive type of grammar. I'm not just positive economics by name, but also by nature. Thank you.
I have a question on a topic that I hear very little discussion of in the media. Is during the property boom, a vast amount of wealth was transferred to the elite in this country, maybe 200 billion, who knows how much money was transferred. And we're paying for this money, this transfer now through massive mortgages, through the bank bailout, through the problems in the exchequer, etc. But this small group of individuals control all of this wealth now. You know, I don't see much money being burned, except maybe in Cork with some northern banknotes. I think the rest of the cash is probably around somewhere. It's invested in assets or wherever. So my question is, you know, all of the bailout costs now are going to be levied on income, today's income and future income. But there's no talk at all about levying costs on wealth that has been accumulated. So what is the international experience in terms of getting these people who have accumulated this massive amount of wealth to pay something like a fair share towards the costs of the recovery and the problems that they've created?
I suppose, I think it was George Dorio said that without action, the world would be just an idea. And there's been some fantastic ideas here today. And I've been delighted to hear it. I've been out of the country for a few years. I'm only just back. But I think what there is, I mean, we were talking earlier about putting in place a visible hand. And I think in the next election, the only way of getting a visible hand is going to be to put a centre-left party, of which there is only one, into power. The reality of the situation is that there's a dearth of candidates, there's a dearth of foot soldiers, and there's a dearth of policies that party is enunciating at the moment. So I think there's a lot of, I suppose, intellectual firepower in this room that could be put at the disposal of that party more actively in terms of, as I say, candidates, foot soldiers and policies. And I suppose I'd encourage people to...
You wouldn't happen to be...
I've only recently joined, about 2 months myself, for that exact reason.
Great, thank you. If you don't mind, I'm going to stay in the audience without going back to the panel, because I know there's some more people want to get in here. One first, there's 3 people with their hands up. This gentleman here with the brown coat.
Hi, Rory. I'm just interested by the piece from Paula Clancy. I'm thinking of like how the Soviet Union tried to coordinate their economy, how hard it was to plan. And I'm just thinking of such a small group of people who are planning a huge chunk of the Irish economy. It's really no wonder they got it wrong.
Thank you. And there's a gentleman here, I think you had your hand up, didn't you? Yes.
We should be much more courageous about addressing the need to increase taxation. There's an expectation in other countries that we will increase taxation, and there seems to be an unwillingness to face up to it in Ireland. That's not a particularly radical thought. Patrick Honohan of the Central Bank about 2 weeks ago pointed out that I think back in 2001, 2002, before the property boom took off, we had a tax base which was given as a surplus. It was not drawing on property, and we had higher levels of income tax, both ordinary level and higher level, than we have now. And the economy was doing rather well, thank you. So So it seems to me perfectly conceivable that we could have a properly functioning, expanding, dynamic economy with much higher levels of income tax than we're ready to contemplate at the minute.
My name is Anne Good and I'm a sociologist and a feminist. I wanted to pick up on the point that was made by the person behind me, the new member of the Labour Party, because I'm also a new member of the Labour Party, and I have a couple of comments to make. First of all, I'm a little disappointed that there isn't representation from the senior levels of the Labour Party here, because I think there are people saying we need leadership, we need to know that there's somebody going to be standing in the next election that are going to be taking up some of these ideas, and I'm not hearing it. So one of the things I want to do is ask Paula, what is the relationship between TASC and the Labour Party in terms of these kind of ideas? But I also want to say I'm a little bit disappointed that people all laughed when he said that he was doing that, because I think there are a lot of people going into the Labour Party over the last year, not because we want to be in political parties, I've never wanted to be in one, but because we want to change this government. And when you look around, I see no other hope of changing the government in the sort of direction that I want, as a person who believes in social justice, equality and feminism, than the Labour Party. If there is, please tell me, but I don't see one. So I think people need to be supported in this, and I can tell you that if you do that, it is salutary, because you go to constituency meetings and you see there are lots of new members who are very ordinary people who want to hear these kind of ideas, who want to know that there is alternative thinking, and it's even more salutary if you go out to the doorsteps and start talking to the electorate, who are so angry, so fearful, and so looking for leadership and guidance. So please don't put people down who are trying to do something within the context of the Labour Party.
Thanks, Sam. I think I speak for everyone. Thank you.
My name is Piruz Danishmandi, and I want to thank TASC for holding this event and for all the work over the years. It's particularly heartening to hear economists talking about equality and social justice, and I wanted to know the panel's view on the way I see it. What's happening is just yet another excuse for transfer of resources from the poorest in the society to the wealthiest in the society. And the only solution that I can see is radical transformation of society, and usually it's scoffed at, but I'd like to know what the panel thinks. Thanks.
If you indulge me, I'm going to take two last questions.
My name is Kieran Perry. I'm an independent councillor from Dublin. I found the conference today absolutely excellent. But my fear now in the last session has become some sort of recruiting drive for the Labour Party. I would have a huge problem with that. Historically, the Labour Party have offered people in my constituency nothing. I don't expect they will offer people in my constituency anything in the future. I think it's very noticeable with all the fantastic ideas that are flying around here today and in previous conferences that Labour have not adopted any of these. They have certainly not provided any leadership to people in my constituency or people in other working class communities around the city or around the country. And I would hope that TASC would not become contaminated with a connection with the Labour Party exclusively and not to other various other viewpoints.
Okay, Kieran, thanks very much. And beside you there.
Yeah, thanks very much, Mark Can. I could come back on the Labour stuff, but
Please
I'm not
don't.
going to. I've got it up from an economics point of view. But I think one of the important things is the progressive forces as a whole should act together and not be knocking each other. There's a bigger kind of enemy to fight rather than each other, and that is the a very big conservative majority in this country and a neoliberal kind of agenda. What I want to ask the panel is, we always hear never waste a good crisis, and the neoliberal kind of front has always been very, very good at that. I think the only time they didn't really manage to progress that was after World War II, where you had several million young soldiers back from the front and had to be looked for, and that's where the welfare state came from. It looks to me now like the welfare state has been deconstructed over the last 20 years with all these different crises, and now we have a very big one, and it looks like it's really going to get a hammering. Look at the Tories over in England. Now, that's one question. Is the welfare state now dead? The second part of that question is, and it kind of ties in with this whole kind of increasing turbulence in the last 20 years or so, and that is this kind of casino-style investments and speculation. It's how the financial markets are going. I mean, something like $1 trillion a day circulating the globe in largely speculative kind of actions. are we going to see not just regulation or regulatory frameworks, which in 10 years' time will be out of vogue and it'll be all light touch again, no doubt, but are we going to see things like the financial transaction taxes brought in? Is this the time to act also on things like, subprimes and leveraged hedge funds and stuff like this to tackle them and maybe take them out of the equation and get more sustainable funding? So that's my question. Is this the time to act, and is it likely, or are we just going to be here in 20 years' time and even more is going to be happening?
Okay,
The question is this: we've addressed economics, politics. The last is the professions. I'm disappointed that the professions, especially the ones that are supposed to help commercial life and civic life, have not done themselves proud in the last 10 years. And it adds to a point that Ray Kinsella made, which is it could take 10 years to repair our society, to get well again. And I'd put it that the professions could lead it, the accountancy and the legal professions. If they didn't actually show themselves to great effect when, for instance, NAMA was announced, there was sort of a very nearly ugly rush to the fee trough instead of standing back to measure the problem. Thanks.
Okay, thank you, Peter. Before we go away, I want to introduce you to an international perspective, and I think the word progressive, and I know this from my own experience in the United States, is a very powerful term, sometimes misunderstood. If you go to the website of the New America Foundation, which has been one of the foremost progressive voices, not just in economics, but on foreign policy as well, you'll see a little quote that sums up this value system: the American ideal that each generation will live better than the last. It's a very simple but very powerful idea. To speak with this international perspective, can I please welcome for our final speaker of the day, Thomas Pally of the New America Foundation. Welcome.
Well, good afternoon. It's a real pleasure to be here and have the opportunity to speak to you. But before I begin, I want to thank TASC for inviting me, and to thank TASC for the very generous and gracious hospitality. This is my first visit to Dublin, and you have made it a terrific experience, or as you might say, a brilliant experience. Whenever I give a talk, I like to make sure that I get my main message across. And here it is. The crisis is a tragedy, but it is also an opportunity. It is an opportunity to create a fair and balanced economy. But to do that, we're going to have to change the economic paradigm. Now, paradigm is a pretty fancy word. It's the type of word you're more likely to hear in a philosophy department than in an economics department. But by the time I'm finished, I hope I can persuade you that it is a really important concept to keep in mind, and it's relevant to all of us, no matter how practical or pragmatic our work. So, 12 months ago, economists were speculating about whether the recovery would be V or U-shaped. But now I think there's a growing realization that it will be L-shaped, where L stands for long stagnation. That should really come as no surprise, because the neoliberal economic paradigm that shaped growth over the past 25 years is exhausted, and it simply cannot be revived. That is a very, very important fact. As a result, we now face a future of prolonged high unemployment, economic insecurity, and elevated income inequality. Worse yet, this bleak economic outlook is accompanied by the additional danger that it might produce a Weimar-styled political backlash. In that ugly scenario, economic distress leads to the rise of a politics of intolerance and hate. And furthermore, if that happens, we could also find ourselves confronted by a doubling down on the neoliberal policies that have already failed us so badly. And I think the debate about austerity is exactly that. It's the beginning of this doubling down. If we are to avoid this future, we need to comprehensively expose the neoliberal economic model, which is the ultimate cause of the crisis. And we also need to offer a clear, compelling economic alternative that really can deliver shared prosperity. So we have two tasks in front of us. One, to expose the failure of these neoliberal ideas, and then to offer a compelling alternative. We are truly living in a moment of crisis that is politically and economically dangerous. But crises are also moments of opportunity. And here, progressives can actually learn from a quote from all people, Milton Friedman. This is a quote drawn from the preface of the 1982 edition of Capitalism and Freedom. Only a crisis, actual or perceived, produces real change. When that crisis occurs, the actions that are taken depend on the ideas that are lying around. That, I believe, is our basic function: to develop alternatives to existing policies, to keep them alive and available until the politically impossible becomes politically inevitable. So, the ultimate response to this crisis will depend in part on the evolution of economic outcomes. The deeper and longer lasting the crisis is, the greater will be the social and political pressures for change. But how those pressures get transformed into policy action will depend on how the crisis is understood and interpreted. That is where ideas enter the picture. How we analytically frame the crisis matters enormously. The significance of ideas explains the importance of the debate about the causes of the crisis, and it explains why there is now a proliferation of explanations. Political interests are hoping to shape society's response to the crisis by shaping its understanding. That is why there is already so much chatter of a new normal of high unemployment and low growth. Such language aims to downsize expectations, create a sense of fatalism, a sense of powerlessness, and also to justify the doubling down on this neoliberal agenda of flexibility and austerity. For neoliberal economists, it's already clear. The argument is we have had a structural shock, which means we need more structural adjustment. Now, broadly speaking, in the US, there exist three different perspectives, and I think you'll hear a resonance with thinking in Europe as well. The neoliberal position, the third way position, and the progressive position. Now, the neoliberal position basically argues that the crisis in the US is rooted in the housing bubble and in its subsequent bust. But the bubble was due to the failures of monetary policy and government intervention in the housing market. So failure number one you'll hear from neoliberals is that the Federal Reserve pushed interest rates too low and held them there for too long. And that was the sort of the monetary policy failure associated with an economist named John Taylor. Failure number two, that is also is part of the neoliberal explanation, is congressional intervention in the housing market via our Community Reinvestment Act and via Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, the mortgage giants, drove up home prices and encouraged home ownership beyond people's means. The third way position, which is very much sort of the position of the Obama administration, is that the crisis was due to inadequate financial regulation. So in the banking sector, we allowed excessive risk-taking by banks, and we also allowed perverse incentive pay structures within banks that encouraged management to engage in loan pushing rather than in good lending. Now, the third perspective is the progressive perspective, and that's what I want to talk about most. Here, too, we clearly recognize, the progressive perspective is that the crisis is rooted in this neoliberal economic paradigm that has guided economic policy. Now, it agrees with the third way view about inadequate regulation and faulty incentive structures, but the argument is that the problem is far deeper than just regulatory failure. You do not get a bubble and a credit crisis of the magnitude that we're now experiencing just because of regulatory failure. The real cause is in a generalized economic policy failure that is rooted in this flawed neoliberal paradigm. So, the trigger or the proximate cause of the crisis was the economic recovery and weak expansion of the early 2000s. That weak expansion was due to a significantly flawed US model of global economic engagement. We in the US created a triple hemorrhage of leakage of demand via the trade deficit, leakage of jobs through the relocation of production offshore, and leakage of investment spending by offshoring of new investment capacity. This global model also contributed to wage stagnation. Put those things together, and the result was weak demand and fear of a falling back into recession. And that's what explains why the Federal Reserve pushed interest rates so low and held them there. And that's what is true, that the Federal Reserve did contribute to the house price bubble through these low interest rates, but it was because there was a justifiable reason. They were afraid the economy was going to fall back into recession because it was so weak. Now, the longer-term cause of the crisis is the change in the economic paradigm that occurred in the late 1970s and early 1980s. Between the period from 1945 to 1975, the US economy was characterized by a virtuous circle Keynesian growth model. And that model was built on two critical ingredients: full employment and a wage system in which wage growth was tied to productivity growth. Put the pieces together, and the logic of the model was as follows. Productivity growth drove wage growth. That fueled demand growth, which in turn created full employment. Full employment then provided an incentive for investment, and investment then fueled further productivity growth. Now, after 1980, that virtuous circle Keynesian growth model was replaced by a neoliberal growth model. And what the key features of this change were that first, there was an abandonment of the commitment to full employment. Second, there was a severing of the link between wages and productivity growth. And whereas before wages were the engine that drove demand growth, now debt and asset price inflation became the engines of demand growth, because wages were now stagnant once that link with productivity growth was broken. And this new system of relying on debt and asset price inflation then creates a new neoliberal asset bubble Keynesianism. And we have successive bubbles, 1980s stock market. In fact, the housing bubble really began in the 1990s, in the mid-1990s when you look at the data. There was a staggering, continuous increase in debt throughout this period. House price bust, there was a property bust in Texas in the early 1990s. There was, of course, the internet bust and the stock market bust in 2000. And then finally, there was the mother of all bubbles, the house price bubble. Now, I would also say that in Europe, there was a similar structural break, though the European experience has been much more heterogeneous. Before 1980, Europe also relied on something akin to this virtuous circle Keynesian growth model. And it's that model which explains Europe's recovery and growth after World War II. Then, around 1980, Europe too abandons the model. I mean, the abandonment is most clear in the UK, where they clearly adopt something very similar to the American model. But in Germany, you begin to set the setting in of wage stagnation, the turn to exports as the source of growth. And more generally, in the macroeconomic sphere, you see a turn to austerity in Europe. You were forced by currency competition to keep interest rates high, and then in the 1990s you had the Maastricht Treaty being put in place. So you have a sort of a neoliberal macroeconomics spreading all over Europe. Now, in both the US and in Europe, the change in economic policy was driven by the global shift to neoliberalism. And that shift is therefore the common denominator between our economic experiences. Now, the shift to neoliberalism installed a new economic paradigm that weakened the position of workers, strengthened the position of corporations, and also uncuffed financial markets to serve the interests of financial and business elites. This new neoliberal paradigm can be described in terms of a policy box that fences workers in on all sides. So you put workers inside the box. And on the outsides of the box, you then put 4 different policies. You have the policy of globalization, free trade, and capital mobility that puts international pressure on workers. And that pressure, by the way, is then amplified through the Washington Consensus that is being implemented globally by the IMF and the World Bank. And it basically spreads this policy box all around the developing world, the emerging markets, so that its impact is multiplied. You push countries to engage in deregulatory competition. You cause wage stagnation everywhere, north and south, that contributes to a growing global demand shortage and deflation pressures. You then, on the other side of the box, you have the small government agenda, the night watchman state of Milton Friedman. So you attack the legitimacy of government activity, and you persistently push deregulation regardless of the dangers. You push it in financial markets, in labor markets, everywhere there's a push for deregulation. On the bottom edge of the box, you then have the labor market flexibility agenda that has been so large in Europe. You attack unions, you attack labor market supports like the minimum wage, you attack unemployment benefits, you attack employment protections, you attack employee rights. And then above, you abandon full employment. And this is the kind of where the language of the shift to inflation targeting and turning central bank management over, making central banks independent, unaccountable, and you basically turn the control of monetary policy over to finance. No worker anywhere in the world can outrun this policy configuration. You simply cannot out-organize this policy configuration. If you manage to unionize, you will be shut down and the jobs will be moved on elsewhere. That has been the American experience. I think there's been in Europe, there's a resonance with this experience. These pieces of this box are implemented globally in different degrees in different countries, but you can find some piece of it in every country. Now, these different explanations make clear what is the three different explanations, the three perspectives I'm talked about. The neoliberal explanation of the crisis, the third way explanation of the crisis, and the progressive explanation of the crisis. It makes clear what is at stake. For the neoliberals, the response to the crisis is simply to further deregulate markets. Government was the problem. We need to deepen central bank independence and the commitment to low inflation, and we need this time to see that we have strict rules-based monetary policy. The Federal Reserve just should have raised interest rates. Forget about the danger of recession. And we further need to shrink government and impose fiscal austerity to deal with the increased government debt that the crisis has produced. Now, for third way supporters, the response is to tighten financial regulation, but then just to continue with the existing policy paradigm. That means there's a continued support for corporate-style globalization. There's a continued support for the so-called labor market flexibility agenda. There's a continued support for low inflation targeting, and there's a continued support for fiscal austerity. But for progressives, the response is fundamentally different. We need to overthrow this neoliberal paradigm and replace it with what I call a structural Keynesian paradigm. We need to repack the box. We need to take workers out of the box and put corporations and financial markets inside the box. And then we're going to put a new edge to the box. Instead of corporate globalization, we're going to have a managed globalization with standards. And instead, we're going to restore the commitment to full employment. We're going to replace the neoliberal anti-government, small government agenda with a social democratic agenda. And we're going to replace the neoliberal labor market flexibility agenda with what I call a social democratic or solidarity-based labor markets agenda. Now, so let me conclude, therefore. The crisis is a massive human tragedy, and it is the result of flawed economic policy based on flawed ideas. But it also provides us with an opportunity to overthrow those ideas and replace them with ideas that will lead to the creation of a fairer, more balanced economy. Now, this will not be easy. There are some things we should learn. And I say one thing we must recognize is that nothing is self-evident. Too often, I've spoken to progressives who said the crisis would open people's eyes, they would see automatically, political victory would fall into your lap. It just doesn't happen that way. The economy is too complicated. The other side is smart. They're going to come up with explanations that are going to have some resonance with people too. Nothing is self-evident. The second thing is that the forces of the status quo will look to block change by promoting their own explanations, and side by side with that, with drowning out other explanations. This is already going on. Anyone who's part of the economics profession, there's a proliferation of explanations within the profession that maintain the status quo, by the way, even though they're all slightly different. And you will never be invited to make a presentation in that sort of forum. I was hearing about this conference on 2 weeks ago or something like that. The Irish Economics Association or something akin had a conference, and of course no progressives were there. Now, one obstacle to a successful resolution here is the economics profession, which is captured by neoliberal ideology. And that means that even when mainstream economists hold progressive values, and there are some mainstream economists who hold progressive values, they will still always be drawn to neoliberal solutions because that's the intellectual framework in their heads. This is a very fundamental problem because the mainstream controls the discourse and it works to delegitimize all other ideas. So part of our task is we have to persuade progressive politicians to ignore the mainstream because it is actually peddling politically and socially toxic ideas that go hand in hand with Wall Street's toxic assets. Now, a second obstacle is that the division among social democrats between progressives who reject neoliberalism as fundamentally flawed and third-way proponents who accept a softer version of neoliberalism in which government offers a helping hand to cushion the blows of the invisible hand. And that is a sort of, you see that division being played out everywhere. In the US, we have that division within the Democratic Party between what's called the New Democrats and you might call the Labour Democrats. In Britain, you have the same position between old Labour and new Labour. In Germany, you have the same division between new Schroeder-type Social Democrats and the old Social Democrats. And that is a very fundamental and difficult political problem. Because if you split with them, you risk a complete triumph of neoliberals. Because when progressives are split, the majority is probably neoliberal. On the other hand, if you stick with them, then you have this problem that we've endured for so long of a very gradual entrenchment of neoliberalism. It comes more slowly, it comes in a softer form, but it is still ultimately entrenched. So this is a political needle that somehow we have to thread. But I come back, I think, to this idea of paradigm and why it's so important. 30 years ago, Margaret Thatcher coined the acronym TINA. There is no alternative. And by that she meant there's no alternative to neoliberal market fundamentalism. Now, I would say that the crisis has bruised TINA, and it's bruised neoliberalism, but it has not demolished it. And now there is actually a danger of a neoliberal rebound. Our challenge is to bury TINA, but that requires changing the paradigm, and that's why it's relevant to everything that we do. Thank you very much.